So hi and welcome back. This is where I continue with this FreeCodeCamp basic HTML and HTML5 walkthrough. So we reached this part about submit buttons and forms, and I mentioned that forms are really important in web development or any web-based system which is running in the browser, because forms are the primary way which you can communicate with the server. So you can send requests from your browser to the server, and you will get data back from the server depending on the server itself and the backend services that are provided for a given application. But for now, let's just walk through this basic section. So I will go into this one, use HTML5 to require a field. So this is about the required attribute, and what it does is that it's almost like a validation system which is built into HTML5. So to make it simple, many times you want to require that a field is filled in. So for instance, let's say the full name or the email address. You want the user who registers the form to add the email address, and if the user doesn't do it, then you should throw an error basically handle the error in some way. And the most basic way of handling this type of error is by adding the required attribute, which is quite simple. So all you do is that you just add the word required. It's not more difficult than that. So I'll just type required like this inside of the input element with the type text. So this is all I write, required. And now if I try to submit this, we get this message which says, please fill out this field. And this is built into the browser. So this is really a really simple way to require a field or make a field required. You should keep in mind that this is not the optimal way to handle errors. It's not even a good way to be fair, because all it does is that it says to the user that this is required. And also if you hover over it, you see please fill out this field. And this is all built into HTML5. But in many cases, or in most cases, you want to either you want to do a more specific client-side validation, meaning that you would probably want to use JavaScript to validate a field. But even that in itself is not sufficient, because in a real system or a real application, if the email address is required, then you should probably check for it on the backend. So you make sure when you write your backend code that the user has to have filled in a valid email address. Not only the address itself, but also that it's a valid one. But this is just some basic validation, and it works fine because it gives you instant feedback. If the field is required, then you get the feedback before even reaching the server, which is the purpose of this attribute. It's basically providing instant feedback for the user. So if I run this test, it passes and I can move on to the next one. So this is about radio buttons. And so what is a radio button? A radio button is basically like almost like just think of a quiz or anything where you can choose one answer. So you can only choose one option among the available ones. And this is unlike checkboxes, because checkboxes allow you to select more than one option. So that's the basic difference between or the key difference between a radio button and a checkbox. So what's this challenge? If we just walk through this, we learned that a radio button is a type of an input. So it's a type of input, which means that it's an input element, but you have to specify the radio type. So you just turn it into a radio by changing the type. And it looks like this. So it's input type radio. And they're mentioning one important thing, which is that number one, since you use radio buttons in order to allow the user to choose one option, you have to group the buttons in some way. And the way that you usually do it is by nesting your radio button inside of a label element. And therefore, everything that surrounds it will, I can show you this in code. It's much more simple. So input, and the type should be radio. And now what I want to do is I want to allow the user to choose an age, and it will be either under 30 or over 30. So I won't have more options than that. So I'll just say P like this. What is your age? We should see this. So the first one will be under 30. And I will add an input right here. So actually I have one, so I'll just remove this, and I will cut this out, and I will paste it inside of here. And if I now click on the labels, now we have under 30. When I click on it, you see that the actual radio button is also activated, basically. So I can just copy this and add another type like this, another radio button, and it will be above 30. And if I click on that one, we see that I click on the label, but it selects the actual button. So it's associated when you have the label element and you nest the input inside of it. And if I click on this one, we now see that both buttons are selected, which is the actual problem with radio buttons if you don't connect them in a way that is explained here. So how do we make sure that the user can only select one radio button? The answer is that you have to add a common name attribute. So you have a common value inside of the name attribute. Like for instance, this will be, what is the common thing between the two? It's age, right? So I'll just add a name attribute like this, name, and I will add the value age. So the attribute name will have the value of age, and I will do the same for the second radio button. And now if I try it out, we see that it can only select one of them, because now the browser knows that these two are connected and they are grouped together, basically. But this is not really how it's supposed to be, so I'll just follow the instructions. So your page should have 2 radio buttons. Yes, so we fulfill this criteria. I can move on. The radio buttons should be given the name attribute of indoor, outdoor. So I'll just take this. I guess age was a bad example. And each of your 2 radio button elements should be nested in its own label element, which is actually occurring right now. So this should be okay. And then the label element should have a closing tag, and they do. We see that we open it and close it. So that's one of the differences between a label element and an input element, that the label element has a closing tag, whereas the input element doesn't. It's self-closing. And one of your radio buttons should have the label indoor. I think what they mean is that actually I missed one thing out, and that is that you also want to, it's a best practice. It's not it's not required. The elements are functioning without this, but what you should do in most cases is that you should have a for attribute on the label element. And you should have the same value, the same for value as an ID of the input. So these two, the for on the label and the ID on the input, these two should be identical. And this is because you want to create a linked relationship between the label and the input. So it's just for it helps out. I think it helps out with the browser recognizing the two as a group or something. So it's basically a good practice. And I also think that if you have the label outside of the input, you don't have to nest it like this. You can have the input outside of it, and it will still work. The thing that I mentioned before, that you can click on the label and it will select the radio. So it works when you group those two together. So now let me just finish off this challenge before it, because the reason why I talk so much about the radio buttons is because it's a confusing topic in the beginning, and don't panic out if you don't understand this right now, because radio buttons is something that I think even many experienced developers don't even know. So this is not really it doesn't hurt if you forget this. You can just Google it up later on, but it's good to understand how label elements and input elements work together. So I'll just add this indoor, and since I added the for attribute, I should also add the ID of indoor to the input element, and I should do the same with the other one. So I will write outdoor, and I will add the ID like this, and each of your radio buttons should be added within the form tag, which is also true. So now it says under 30, I can just write indoor, just to stay consistent with everything else, so it doesn't look yeah. So right now everything works as we want. So the label is connected to the input with the for and the ID attributes, and these two are grouped with the common name attribute. So these are the attributes that you should know when it comes to radio buttons. So if I run this, it works. Okay, so I think we're getting closer to the last parts of this section. So now we move on to checkboxes, which are similar but not the same as radio buttons. And I mentioned before that the key difference between a radio button or radio buttons and checkboxes is that radio buttons should only allow one option. So the user only chooses one option. So it's a question where you can't have multiple answers. It only has one answer. Whereas the checkboxes answer a question which could have multiple answers, basically. Or, for instance, which hobbies do you have, or which are your favorite dishes, and you can choose more than one. So it allows more than one answer, basically. And they are also an input element, but they have the type of checkbox. So it's the same. It's basically the same. What do you say? It's the same principles. So it also has a label, and you nest it inside of it, which is a good practice, even though you don't have to. And you basically add the ID to the input, which should correspond to the for attribute of the label element. And you also need to have a common name attribute. So I will just follow these tests. So your page should have 3 checkbox elements. I guess I can just place it underneath the or exactly above the button. So I'll just add the labels to begin with. So label open and close, and inside of it I will add the input with the type of checkbox like this. And now we should see a checkbox. Yeah, and we do. I'll actually add a breaker right here so we can see it on a different, but it's right here. It's quite difficult to see, but hopefully you see the checkbox. So I will add personality. What should I say? Nice or something. So that would be personality, and it should be 3. So I'll just copy and paste this. And actually, this is wrong because it has to be. It should be inside of the label element, and I'll just copy this and paste it two more times. And the indenting, of course, as I mentioned before, that when you nest something, you want the nested element to be indented a little bit, so pushed into, yeah, more to the right. And now, so I fulfill these 2 tests. I should make sure that the label element has a closing tag. It does, and they should have the common attribute of personality. So I'll just add name and personality like this, and I will copy this attribute and paste it here and here. I think this should do it. So okay, now everyone says nice. So nice, not so nice, and evil. So 3 personalities, and I can check each one of them, and I can click on the label. I don't have to click on the box itself. I can click on the label, and as I mentioned, the reason is that they are grouped together because yeah, it's the label basically. So when you nest it, you group it, but you don't have to group it or nest it in order for it to be grouped. As I said, either you nest it, or you nest the input inside of that label, or you basically add the for attribute to the label and the ID to the input, and then you can have the input somewhere else. So I hope that makes sense. It works. I'll just move on to the next challenge. Before I do that, I just want to see in the curriculum how much do I have left. So I think we're almost there. So we have 4 left. I think I'll pause the video here and we'll move on.